June 24th, 1812. The earth shook as 600,000 men marched toward the Russian border. This was the Grande Armée, the largest, most terrifying fighting force the world had ever seen. At its head was a man who seemed more like a god than a mortal, Napoleon Bonaparte. He had crushed Austria. He had shattered Prussia. He had redrawn the map of Europe with the tip of his sword. And now he was coming for the Russian Empire. Napoleon told his generals this campaign would take 20 days. He expected a quick, glorious victory, but he was marching straight into a fatal trap. What started as a guaranteed conquest would end in the complete and total annihilation of his invincible army. Out of the 600,000 men who marched in, barely 100,000 would stumble out. So, how did Russia prepare for the greatest conqueror in history? How did they turn his own strengths against him? And who was left covered in absolute shame and disgrace? This is the story of the deadliest military disaster of the 19th century. To understand the betrayal, we have to go back 5 years to 1807. After Napoleon defeated the Russians at Friedland, he didn't destroy them. Instead, he met with Russian Tsar Alexander I on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. The two emperors famously hugged, flattered each other, and divided Europe between them. It was the ultimate geopolitical bromance. But there was a catch. Napoleon forced Russia to join his continental system. Think of this as a massive European boycott of Great Britain. Napoleon couldn't beat the British Navy, so he decided to starve their economy by banning anyone in Europe from trading with them. For Russia, this was an economic disaster. Russia survived by selling massive amounts of timber, grain, and iron to the British. Without British money, the Russian economy began to collapse. By 1810, Tsar Alexander had had enough. He quietly opened his ports back up to British smugglers and slapped huge taxes on French luxury goods. When Napoleon found out, he was furious. The bromance was officially over. Napoleon began massing troops in Poland, preparing to teach the Tsar a lesson. But what Napoleon didn't realize was that Alexander was already 2 steps ahead of him. Before a single shot was fired, Russia won the intelligence war. The Tsar sent 2 brilliant young diplomats to Paris, Count Nesselrode and a handsome, charismatic officer named Alexander Chernyshев. Chernyshев was a master spy. He infiltrated the highest levels of Parisian society. He bribed Napoleon's own ministers, charmed the French nobility, and built a massive spy ring right under the emperor's nose. Because of him, the Tsar received monthly updates detailing the exact movements, numbers, and supplies of the French army. Russia literally had Napoleon's playbook, but Chernyshев also secured something far more valuable: psychological intelligence. He spoke to French officers who secretly hated Napoleon. They told the Russian spy, "Napoleon is obsessed with huge, decisive battles. He wants to knock you out in one punch. So whatever you do not fight him." The message was clear. To defeat the god of war, Russia had to refuse to play his game. They needed to retreat, harass his supply lines, and let the sheer, terrifying size of the Russian landscape bleed him dry. Russia knew they couldn't survive if they had enemies on all sides. So, in a stroke of diplomatic genius, they cleared the board. They secured an alliance with Sweden in the north and rapidly signed a peace treaty to end their ongoing war with the Ottoman Empire in the south. This freed up tens of thousands of hardened combat troops just weeks before Napoleon invaded. With the flanks secure, Russian War Minister Barclay de Tolly instituted one of the most brutal and controversial strategies in human history, the scorched-earth policy. The Russian army wouldn't defend the border, they would run, and as they ran, they would burn their own country to the ground. They burned crops, slaughtered livestock, poisoned wells, and destroyed bridges. It was a devastating sacrifice. The Russian generals hated it. The Russian people hated it. But Barclay de Tolly knew it was the only way. If Napoleon wanted Russia, he would inherit nothing but ashes. In June 1812, Napoleon crossed the Niemen River into Russia. He brought over 600,000 men, thousands of cannons, and massive supply trains. But the trap immediately snapped shut. The French didn't find a glorious battle. They found a ghost country. The summer heat was boiling. Without fresh food or clean water, Napoleon's army began to drink from stagnant, muddy puddles. Before a single major battle was fought, the Grande Armée was decimated by invisible killers, typhus and dysentery. Men were collapsing by the thousands every single day. Horses died of starvation, forcing the French to abandon their heavy artillery. Finally, in September, a frustrated Tsar Alexander replaced Barclay de Tolly with General Kutuzov, who decided to turn and fight just outside of Moscow, at a place called Borodino. The Battle of Borodino was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. 70,000 men were killed or wounded in a matter of hours. It was a terrifying, point-blank meat grinder. Both sides claimed victory, but the Russian army survived and retreated once again. The road to Moscow was wide open. Napoleon thought he had won. He marched his exhausted troops into the great city, expecting the Tsar to surrender. Instead, he found a nightmare. Moscow was totally abandoned. And that night, on the orders of the city's Russian governor, secret operatives set Moscow on fire. The wooden city erupted into a towering inferno. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as his ultimate prize burned to the ground. He sat in the charred ruins for an entire month, waiting for a letter of surrender from the Tsar. The letter never came. Realizing his army would starve, Napoleon ordered the retreat. But it was too late. The dreaded Russian winter arrived. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Men froze to death mid-stride. Weapons stuck to their hands. Starving soldiers were forced to eat their own dead horses. And out of the blinding snow came the Cossacks, ruthless, lightning-fast Russian cavalrymen who hunted the stragglers without mercy. The climax of this horror happened at the Berezina River. As the French desperately tried to cross makeshift bridges, the Russian army closed in and fired cannons into the trapped crowd. Thousands drowned in the freezing water or were crushed to death in the panic. It was pure, unfiltered apocalypse. And what did the great Napoleon Bonaparte do? He left them. Realizing his political power in Paris was failing, Napoleon abandoned his dying army, jumped into a fast sled, and fled back to France under the cover of night. The man who had conquered Europe was completely covered in shame and disgrace. Out of the 600,000 men he brought into Russia, fewer than 100,000 crossed back over the border. Napoleon's Russian campaign was the beginning of the end. By refusing to play by his rules, sacrificing their own land, and using the brutal forces of nature, Russia didn't just defeat an army, they broke the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. It was a fatal trap that changed the course of human history forever. What do you think was Napoleon's biggest mistake? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.